Our farmers are so excited to engage with their customers. They're so passionate about growing their crops. We'll have delegations come in, and by the time they leave, it feels like they're old friends.
Oh my gosh. Meet Dana Dickerson. Her food job is helping Ontario farmers find new ways to sell their crops and reach more people. She's the Market Development and Sustainability Manager at Grain Farmers of Ontario. So in this conversation, you will hear about how Dana's career came full circle.
He never would have thought I would end up working for kind of what his grandparents did on the farm. So it really has felt full circle for me.
How to learn on the job.
I can read a lot about them, but until I go and sort of engage and experience them in situ, it doesn't always crystallize in my brain.
And cool facts about Ontario grain.
We use what we call integrated pest management. So you're looking at ways to make sure that you're not growing the same crop over and over again.
Thank you to the Canadian Food Innovation Network for sponsoring this podcast.
Sure. So my name is Dana Dickerson. I'm the Manager of Market Development and Sustainability at Grain Farmers of Ontario. I've been at the organization for actually just 3 years this month. So Grain Farmers is the largest commodity association in the province of Ontario. We support and are funded by over 28,000 farmers in the province, growing barley, corn, oats, wheat, and soybeans. And my job is to support them in developing and growing and protecting their markets, both at home here in Canada and abroad internationally.
Wow, that's exciting. I know again, when mentioning the conference, I learned a lot about grains in Ontario. I had no idea about soybean, and to the extent of that, you have to share that fact out with everyone because it really surprised me.
For sure. Yeah. So I think when a lot of people in Canada think about agricultural production, they think about the prairie provinces and Western Canada and wheat and canola, or maybe they think about PEI and potatoes and seafood. But I always like to remind people that Ontario is a huge powerhouse in agricultural production, and particularly in grains and oilseeds. So for us in Ontario, we grow barley and oats on a relatively smaller scale, still very important crops for our farmers, especially in Northern Ontario, where they're growing oats for Quaker, for example. But the big three crops for us in the province are corn, soybeans, and wheat. So corn is our biggest crop in Ontario, and we actually lead Canada's production for corn, growing over 65% of the annual production of corn. And it's actually Canada's third largest crop by volume. Soybeans are our second largest crop in Ontario, and we grow about 60% of Canada's soybeans, and it's Canada's fifth largest crop by volume and third largest by value. So soybeans have really high value because we export them to some really premium markets like Japan, where they go into tofu and soy milk and that sort of thing. And then we can't claim a huge crown for winter wheat because although it's Canada's largest crop in Ontario, we only grow about 8% of Canada's wheat, but we do grow the largest proportion of Canada's winter wheat or soft wheat. So we grow about 85% of that type of wheat. And it's a really interesting wheat. It's different than the higher protein wheat you get in the West, which goes a lot into kind of your risen breads and things that require a little bit more elasticity and gluten strength. The wheat that we grow here is a specialty type of wheat for cookies and cake and pastry flours. So it has lower protein, bit of a different functionality, and it's really sustainable. It's grown over the winter period, so it provides a living cover for soils in the province while the farmers are in between corn and soy crops.
I see. That is the cool stuff that I learned at the event because I had no idea. The corn, I had a general idea. I mean, living in Ontario, it's very hard to miss corn, but the soybean, that was totally new to me because, like you mentioned, I know a lot of the Asian markets are very big for soy. So I thought naturally they grew it, most of it. I never even thought about like Ontario having that.
Absolutely. Yeah, like our markets in Japan and I was in Japan and Thailand recently promoting Ontario soy, and they absolutely love the quality of the food grade soy that we grow here. So our farmers will actually purchase very specific varieties of soybeans that are meant for tofu production or for natto production. And they really tend to them in the growing season. They can be really fussy crops to grow because they have to be really high quality, really clean, high protein, very white. And so they get a premium for them at the end of the day based on all of that. But yeah, Canada is actually one of the leading regions for quality when it comes to soybeans.
That is really cool. So I know if I go to my trip to Japan, I might actually be eating Canadian soy without even realizing it.
Absolutely. You might even see a maple leaf on the product when you go there. That's how much they love Canadian soy.
Oh, that's cool. Well, you did a little segue to, you visited Japan and Thailand as part of your role. So let's dive a little bit more into you. And can you explain what your role is at the Grain Farmers of Ontario?
Yeah, for sure. So, really, my job is to protect, maintain, and grow markets for the five crops that our farmers represent: barley, corn, oats, wheat, and soy, from an industry aggregate perspective. So, I don't get involved in the individual transactions of a farmer selling their crops to a local grain buyer or, to a flour miller or to an export customer or anything like that. But my job is to sort of look at all the production from an all of Ontario industry perspective, understand the production story, the quality story, the sustainability story, the value proposition of Ontario grains, and then go and promote those to different customers domestically or around the world. So a lot of our customers know our crops really well, but they still want to engage with us to understand how the growing season has progressed, what kind of quality we're seeing, because it changes from year to year. So we do a lot of work communicating, the quality and value of the grains that come out at the end of harvest and how that is looking from a provincial aggregate perspective. We also translate a lot of sustainability information, so how farmers are approaching growing the crops, what kind of best practices and techniques they use, helping to translate those down the value chain. So, the first customer for a grain farmer might be a local elevator, and then beyond them might be a flour miller. And those two groups, they're pretty close to the farm, but as you get further away, as you get to maybe a breakfast cereal processor or a baker or a grocery retailer, they're really far away from the farm. So my job is to help connect those dots and make sure that all those customers are confident in what they're getting out of Ontario, that they're continuing to invest, that they're using our crops in new and unique ways, that they're investing in more value-added processing in the province. So it's really just a lot of customer engagement and making sure I understand what's happening on the farm and can translate that to customers. And I understand what customers are asking for and what they want to know about the farm, and I can translate that back to farmers so they can prepare to
Okay.
navigate those markets.
Wow, that sounds really cool.
It's really fun.
Yeah, with so the thing that popped up in my head is that you're representing farmers as a whole, because when we think about selling products, we think of an individual product. So let's say this is grain from this farmer, I'm selling you it as that. How do you communicate that it's as an industry as a whole? And because I don't know if the whole industry, let's say farmers from across Ontario, do they experience similar um, I'm thinking about the growing season. How do you communicate the differences between the farms? And I guess that's going over my
I
head a
know
little bit.
exactly what you're getting at, Veronica. I know exactly what you mean. And actually, the thing about Ontario that's challenging and amazing is that it's incredibly diverse. We have
Hmm.
so many little microclimates, and the landscapes and the temperatures
Yeah.
across the province are hugely dynamic. So even the types of crops that you can grow in one part of the province are different to another. So we do grow some higher protein wheat in the province of Ontario, but that typically does best in the more northern and eastern parts of the province where it's a bit cooler. And then we get our greatest corn yields in the most southerly part of the province. And what we've been seeing the last few years is a lot of variation
Hmm.
in temperature and rainfall, and that can impact quality and all those sorts of things. So it really depends on who the customer is that we're speaking to, but we actually go as far in depth as doing an annual wheat harvest quality survey every year. So within my team, I've got a coordinator, and she works to collect 350 samples of wheat from across the province as harvest is happening, and each sample is tracked for where it's coming from and what it represents. And we're analyzing the quality of those samples in real time with a partner lab, and they're reporting results to us. So we're understanding kind of where the protein is in the 4 main quadrants of the province. And at the end of the year, we create composites and mill those composites and bake them. And we can say in the most southerly part of the province, cookies we're baking like this, cookies
Wow.
using flour from wheat in that region will have more spread this year, or they'll be a little bit higher this year, which is really helpful for big major cookie manufacturing customers who want that consistency, and they want to know how to manage their flour procurement so that they can have a real consistent cookie. So yeah, it's trying to wrap your head around that big picture. And the regions are diverse, but also the farms are diverse. So, people often ask me about farm practices, and every farm is different, especially here in Ontario, where we tend to have a lot more smaller farms than in other parts of the world, like the US or Western Canada, where they tend to have larger acreages.
That's interesting. I didn't know that as well. Huh.
Yeah.
Well, I will definitely dive more into that sustainability aspect because I know people are interested, but I do want to take a step back and again talk more about you and how you got into this role because I know 3 years is new, but not too new in a role, but you didn't go to school for agriculture and such. So I'd love to just kind of walk into how did you get here?
Sure. How much time do you have? It's kind of a long story. So, I was born and raised in Northern Ontario in Thunder Bay. My father came from a grain farming background. His parents were grain farmers down in Chatham, Kent, which is really kind of the heartland of grain agriculture in Ontario. But he moved to Thunder Bay, met my mom, and had me up there. So I was born and raised in a fairly rural, isolated community, but I always wanted to get out and see the world. So I did 2 exchanges, one in high school and one in university. I went to France on exchange in high school and the UK in university and spent a year in each country just to kind of get out of the Northern Ontario bubble. Um, and so that really set the tone for me in terms of wanting to have an international aspect to my career. So I studied international business and French at home at Lakehead. And then after I graduated, my first real job, apart from co-ops that I had done or internships I had done in the summers in Thunder Bay, my first real internship after university was working for the Quebec government. So I got hired for their Ministry of Economic Development, Innovation and Export Trade, was what it was named at the time. And I worked in export promotion for the government. So it was a similar role in the sense that I was promoting a Canadian industry to international markets, but it was actually the Quebec mining equipment industry,
Okay,
promoting it
okay.
into sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, that's its own story.
That's another podcast story, but I did that for a work term over 6 months, lived in Montreal and loved it. That internship concluded. I moved to Toronto, where my then boyfriend, now husband, was working at his dream job. It was after the 2008 recession. There wasn't a lot of great jobs out there in export promotion. Governments weren't hiring a ton. So I went and worked for 2 years as a project manager at a corporate communications company, which just felt like a little bit of a blip in my career because it wasn't exactly what I wanted to do, but it exposed me to a lot of the sustainability side of things because I did corporate social responsibility reporting and customer CSR websites and stuff like that. So gave me a really good foundation for professional work. And then a job came up at the British Consulate-General in Toronto. So they were hiring local Canadians to work for the UK government, employed at the consulate, and I ended up working there for about 8.5 years. So I started out as a trade associate, helping British companies export to Canada, covering a lot of different sectors, from financial services to mining to creative sector, tech, all kinds of sectors. So I had to develop an ability to learn about a sector and learn about companies and learn about market opportunities and do a lot of research and be able to promote something I, didn't know a ton about initially.
Mhm.
So I did that for a couple of years, and then I was promoted to become the trade officer for the food and drink and retail sector. did that for a few more years for Canada. And then I ended up taking on a North American role within that job. So I headed up the food and drink sector and the consumer goods sector for the UK government for North America. So my job was making sure that the UK had a really strong export strategy for helping British consumer goods companies develop the Canadian market and the US market. So managed a team of about 14 different people in 7 consulates across North America,
Oh my gosh.
um, all providing services to companies. And so it's sort of like helping them understand how to navigate the markets, but then also promoting them individually and promoting the UK food and drink sector through kind of a communications campaign. And then also working on a lot of trade policy because there was Brexit, there was the CETA agreement, there were multiple prime ministers that cycled through the UK government.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So yeah, so then I was there for 8.5 years. I kind of spent quite a long time in one organization, and I was working more in agriculture because I was working with, UK food and drink, but it
Hmm.
really wasn't pure agriculture. It was more like consumer packaged goods products like
Right.
gin or whiskey or some beef and lamb. And I was really interested because Canada is an agricultural powerhouse and I wanted to work for my home team. I'd spent a lot of time working for a foreign government, which I loved. I was really passionate about British companies, but I'm really passionate about where our food comes from in Canada. And I wanted to take all the skills I had learned supporting the UK and translate that to supporting our homegrown food and drink sector.
Wow.
So Grain Farmers of Ontario came calling, and I didn't know very much about grains and their uses in the early days. So it was a big learning curve, but in the end, it's become an incredible role. And I still get to work with whiskey and gin companies because our corn goes into Canadian
Hmm.
whiskey and vodka and all that sort of stuff. I still get to work with, beef and lamb because our crops are going to animal feed in those spaces. So all the end use stuff I had learned working for the Brits is still really relevant to me today, even though I'm much higher up the value chain.
That is so, if people didn't know, they would think that everything in between, it made sense that you just went from start to finish. Like there's this full circle that you've probably been told many times or thought about.
Yes. My dad can't believe that he never would have thought I would end up working for kind of what his grandparents did on the farm. So it really has felt full circle for me.
I love that. I love that. And as you mentioned throughout, you had to learn about a lot of different industries, a lot of different, in your current role, you are as well. But how do you learn, going from mining to food? That's very different. Like, what are some of the techniques that you use to pick up on these bits of knowledge as you went along?
Yeah, it can be difficult. I have quite a trivia brain, so you heard me rattling off some
Yeah.
stats here. I watch Jeopardy every night, so I literally have a weird knack for retaining certain things in my brain, which really helps me. So there's a lot of things where I have sort of, the British would say like a mile wide and an inch deep of knowledge. So I think you have to recognize when you're in a role like this that I'm covering 5 crops and probably like thousands of different
Hmm.
end uses that I'm meant to know something about. And a lot of different disciplines like marketing, policy, trade, like all this sort of stuff. So, you have to recognize at the end of the day in a role like this for an association, you're going to be a generalist and you can't know everything in depth. There's certain things you need to really know in depth. And I find for me, I'm an experiential learner. So I can read a lot about them, but until I go and sort of engage and experience them in situ, it doesn't always crystallize in my brain. So I find like the trade missions, we've gone to Japan to meet with soy customers, or last year I went to Mexico and Colombia to promote Ontario wheat. When you go visit customers and visit their facilities where they're processing the crops, to me, it forms like a core memory of how they're using the crops and what they value and what we talk about. And that I just find helps me retain it in a way that um, it just stays with you for a longer time. So for me, anytime I can get out in the field, go visit a farmer, talk to them about how they're growing things, go visit a facility, even if it seems like the most mundane type of facility to the average person, like a grain elevator, I get really excited about it. I'm just a huge experiential learner.
It's amazing that you found a job where you can also travel around, but you still have this stability, working with an association that for many, if they want to travel, it means being like a digital nomad and blogging, but you're representing the country, you're doing good work, but then at the same time, you get to explore new places and see how they're culturally different to how they might process here. That's really cool.
For sure. It's one of the best parts of the job, I would say, is getting the opportunity to go and promote our crops around the world. And even more so, actually, better than going and seeing customers at their facilities, I love having them come here because there's nothing like bringing someone from a different country to a farm and having them just be wowed by Canada's, natural spaces and our production systems and just how we do things here. It's incredible seeing it through their eyes.
Oh, that would be really cool. And what are some of the things that they are surprised about when they get here? Or
I think they're often surprised by the size of our farms, even here in Ontario where we have smaller farms, but the size and the scale, the sophistication of the technology and the investments that farmers make into growing a really high quality crop for them. We really try to showcase that when they're here. So, we'll have a delegation come in and we'll show them everything from how plant breeding is done to create the seeds that farmers plant all the way through to the agronomy and the technology for production. And then, even our facilities, our grain export facilities are highly automated. We have an export terminal in Hamilton where the plant manager can receive shipments from an iPad at his house. It's so technologically advanced. So I think that's a huge part of it is just the level of investment that we put into agriculture and to our crops. But I think also the passion that people have. Our farmers are so excited to engage with their customers. They're so passionate about growing their crops. And I think that really comes through. And, we'll have delegations come in, and by the time they leave, it feels like they're, you know, old friends. And when you see them again in other markets, it's such a warm reception. So that's a big part of it.
that's really cool. It's always nice to be able to share what you love and then see them change over time and see it in a new eye. So I can see why you'd really enjoy that aspect of the job.
For sure.
With that being said, you did talk about tech, and that was actually something I did want to talk a little bit more about because I'm still learning. And I do know that there's a lot of technological innovations happening. Farmers aren't just out on a tractor. It's just not the case. But I think a lot of us don't hear about that. So, would you be able to talk a little bit more about how grain farmers are able to use technology and just point out some cool things for us?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole gamut of tech available to farmers. A lot of people think about the combine or the tractor that they're using to
Mhm.
plant or to harvest their crops. And those have become incredibly, like, the newer, more expensive ones have become really technologically advanced. So you've got everything from like auto steer and, eventually talk about self-driving tractors and that sort of thing. I'm not sure every farmer would be up for that. It's one of their, parts of their job that they really like is being
Yeah.
in the tractor and being in control of it. But increasingly, those tractors are equipped with a lot of digital technology that allows them to map the fields and to apply their nutrients or their crop protection products in a really precise way. There's actually, I think it's John Deere has a technology that uses sort of color analysis and allows the tractor to like spot specific plants that are weeds and target them with like a crop protection application, like a pesticide, and leave the other plants, untouched. So
Mhm.
there's some really cool stuff happening with that. We're seeing a lot of farmers get incredibly savvy about like aerial mapping of their fields using drones or plains, and then they're able to better understand the topography of their field, where they might have spots that are cooler or hold more water, or have, they can come out in that with soil testing and figure out which areas have like more requirements for nutrients, and then really map out a plan so that they're maximizing the efficiency of their nutrients that they're applying, whether it's manure or fertilizer or whatever. So, I mean, technology is a huge part of our sustainability story. And I think it's costly to adopt a lot of that fancy new technology. It can be complicated. It's a lot of data that farmers are dealing with. We're getting into kind of big data spheres here, so sometimes it's just as hard to unpack all that data as it is to collect it. But certainly, it's we're moving into a realm where things are getting increasingly more efficient. We know a lot more about our fields. And I always tell people, like, it's growing food is not like manufacturing food, because when you manufacture food, you're in a controlled environment with a roof. When you're growing food outside, you've got weather, you've got the elements, you've got, animals, you've got all kinds of things. And so the best laid plans for producing a crop can easily be put sideways by Mother Nature. And so the more tools farmers have at their disposal to help manage that sort of stuff, the better off they're going to be.
It's good that farmers are getting more tools, because I'm always just amazed, just farmers in general. They are amazing that what they're able to do, weather the elements, plan for years to come. Like, there's just so many elements, and yet they still are able to do it. It's amazing, and so grateful for the food that are produced, because it's not an easy job.
They're some of the most resilient people, and that's one of the best parts of my job, is working on behalf of such an incredible discipline, professional discipline. And I often say to people, in order to be a farmer today, you have to understand like agronomy, like crop biology. You have to understand environmental science, like how the environment's going to, impact things. You have to almost be a meteorologist. You have to be an economist, because you have to understand grain markets, which are constantly fluctuating. You have to be a marketer. You often have to be a mechanic, because if your tractor breaks down in the middle of a small planting window, you've got to get it back up and running. And you have to be a politician. You're going to engage in sort of like political debates on the future of agriculture in the country and all that. So there's so many different hats that farmers have to wear. And it really is one of the most entrepreneurial roles in the country, I would say.
Not something I would expect to hear, but it makes sense as you're saying it. And then that makes me think, though, for the listeners that are listening, many of them are not farmers, or they wouldn't be listening to the podcast. Many of them are in maybe roles, they're in computer science, they're into all these adjacent roles. Are there opportunities for someone who has, let's say, a computer science background, or has a chemistry background? More so, I'm thinking about the data science, because I'm thinking back to our little conference that we went to. Some of those students, where are there opportunities for someone who's interested in tech to come into this field?
There's so many, absolutely. I think a lot of the solutions, like that we just talked about, the technological solutions or the science solutions that farmers need, are going to come from that sector. We have a fixed amount of land to grow food on in this country, and we've got to make sure it remains productive. And so we have some big industrial challenges ahead of farmers. We've got to think about, how do we really continue to increase yields and grow more food on the same amount of land over time, while minimizing like the amount of inputs wherever possible. We need to think about how we can grow food in future weather conditions as the climate changes, and some parts of the province might get warmer, some parts of the province might see more volatile weather. How can we manage some of the crop quality issues that can result from those changes over time? are there, new things that we can start growing, incorporating into the rotation to support our crop if other things that we previously grew in one place are no longer viable? So there's so much in the agricultural space, from kind of the plant science and the crop protection science side of things, where there's big industrial challenges and need for data and innovation, whether it's from, services, like software services for farmers to help them with decisions, whether it's in the realm of robotics to help them with kind of physical machinery on the farm, whether it's even just, the policy of the future to make sure that farming is still a viable career for people, when right now it is really challenging, I would say. Inflation's very high. All the cost of inputs are very high for farmers right now to be able to buy their seed and buy all the products that they need to plant their crop and maintain, interest rates on the land that they might be renting or paying off debt on, how they can manage all of that when they're price takers. So the price is set through global commodity markets, and they're really limited in terms of, what that kind of margin is for them. So I think we're going to need people from all different walks of life. I really encourage anyone who doesn't come from an agricultural background to think about the sector, because like me, I didn't come from a pure agricultural background. And I think people in agriculture are very warm and welcoming to those who come from a different disciplinary background, because they want new ideas. They want kind of a fresh perspective on things. And it's a really warm community to be part of once you're in there.
I like that. I like that. I like hearing that it's a warm community. I'm in the more the food processing space, so I know about that one, but I know that the cousin is the agriculture side. So it's nice to
Yeah.
hear that they're welcoming as well.
And actually, just on the food processing side, like I would add that too, is just like me, I look at the downstream markets. We're really interested in what are the future uses for our grains and oil seeds. So, today we might be making bakery products with wheat flour, right? But tomorrow there could be, I don't know, like a really innovative fermented product that is made out of wheat grains that could be something totally new that we don't know about yet. So
Mm-hmm.
farmers are really interested. We invest in that food innovation. One of the things my team actually manages is a grains innovation fund. So we have $250,000 annually of farmer invested money that we allocate, my team allocates with the farmer panel's recommendations to different industry projects that are going to increase the utilization or innovative use of Ontario grains. So we had someone who was milling flour and had a lot of bran left over, and she created a regenerative kitty litter product that's entirely compostable out of the excess bran to save it from being wasted.
That's so
We've had
cool.
we have a company who's taking like soybean oil and making a road paint that eliminates the use of latex plastic and road paint that eliminates microplastics in the environment. So like we're always looking for what's the next generation product that can be used from our grains, because we've seen over time that products phase out or they change or consumer preferences change, and our farmers want to remain at the forefront of those food trends.
That is so cool. See, so this is the more I learn. There's so many problems that you don't even think about, and there could be a more sustainable way. You just kind of accept it for what it is. But there's so many for someone to link even thinking about grains with kitty litter. I think that just blows my mind.
It's wild. It's incredible. We've seen a lot of that the past couple of years. There's a big trend of upcycling.
Mm-hmm.
And so, trying to take products, and this has been something we've been doing in the grain sector for forever.
Yeah.
The reason that we have Canadian whiskey is because flour millers in Southern Ontario back in like the 1800s needed to find something for their leftover bran and all the kind of byproduct from the milling process. And so people started distilling it and making whiskey with it. And so, that whole sector came out of an upcycling opportunity. And that's what we're still seeing today is like upcycling, but it's getting even more innovative. It's incredible what scientists are looking at now.
That's for sure. And with a lot of, we mentioned about the students, there's all different walks of life from the technology to that. But where are they actually working, would you say, for these opportunities? Because I sometimes don't know what to tell a student who's in tech. Are they working at the startups? Are they working at the universities through research? Would you be able to elaborate a little bit more about where the opportunities are besides working right on the farm?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot in academia, like the Arel Food Institute, for example. There's some really incredible students researching in that space right now that are going into some of the policy think tanks when it comes to shaping the future for agriculture. I would say within the food sector as well, there's a lot of like innovation labs, and the startups are definitely a big thing. I actually just hired someone who's joined us as our market development coordinator who came from BioEnterprise, which is really an accelerator group that helps startups in the food and drink sector. And she's worked with a ton of different startups across the board. And there's a lot of really young, brilliant minds coming into those groups. So I'd say like in the food and drink sector, quite a lot of startups. In the, kind of crop science and crop protection side of things, there's a lot of major, big companies like Syngenta or Bayer or BASF, and they have a lot of folks working on innovation. And then there's also smaller, independent plant breeders or independent crop science companies. We're seeing a lot in like the biological space coming up. So crop protection products that are biologic products. And there's a ton of different startups coming out through there where they're just trying to come up with sort of new ideas for crop protection that are maybe different from some of the traditional methods. So I think it's kind of everywhere. I would
Okay.
say we still have a lot of the traditional, like working at a farm elevator or for a grain trading or exporting company. And I would say those roles have really changed over the years because traditionally it was just buying from a farmer and then selling to an export market. But increasingly, as those markets are becoming more sophisticated in their interest in sustainability, in data, in traceability, and in quality, they are having more complicated demands in terms of capturing insight on the crop and the farmers that grew the crops. And so the people who work in those companies are having to have a lot more disciplinary functions across, merchandising, but also the sustainability side of things.
It's good to know that there is opportunities everywhere and you might not even realize that there's more opportunities than you think. And being at a university or being at a college might already put you at an advantage because you can just look into what accelerator product programs are going through my school right now. Maybe I could join the team or even just create the idea. So there's a lot of opportunities if you just looked around.
For sure. And I would say like consider associations as well, like,
Hmm.
Grain Farmers of Ontario. Um, we're really interesting because we're not like government. You don't
Mm-hmm.
have some of the bureaucracy that comes with government, but it's also different from the private sector. And it can be really rewarding because you're not just working for kind of one, individual corporation with a set of goals. You're working on behalf of a bigger picture on behalf of, like, for us, it's 28,000 members, a significant chunk of the sector. So it can be really rewarding. It's a different type of role, different expectations. But I personally really enjoyed it. And it's a really rewarding kind of role to be in.
That's a good way to put it because, as well, when we think of farms, you'd almost think that there'd be competition amongst them because, I'm making grain, you're making grain. You can't have the same seller as me. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think farmers are really good at like coming together, especially on big issues that they care about. And market development is a big one for them. They've seen, historically where some global markets have been closed off for one reason or another, right? Maybe there's a political issue or, even a logistical issue that's closed off a market like COVID. And I think they really understand the value of a bigger picture approach and coming together to have advocacy from a centralized voice.
Mm. And with that relating to sustainability in a way, what are some of the overall sustainability? What are some of the sustainable practices that farmers are starting to implement more? Because I know you're very aware with that. And are they different than other aspects of the world? Is there something that Ontario is really innovating in comparison?
Yeah, for sure. So sustainability, it's a journey, right? And I struggle sometimes to compare to other parts of the world because everyone's farming different crops in different environments a lot of the time and at different times of year. But I will say there's a few areas where we really excel at in Ontario. And that is, I think our farmers really like a lot of our farmers are multi-generational families who are hoping to pass their farms down onto their kids because they inherited their farms from their parents. And so they really see it as a long-term initiative. And they really care about soil quality. They care about, the environment around their farms. We have, like I said, very small farms, often in areas that have a lot of natural environments in and around them. So lots of riparian buffers, forests, waterways. We farm in and around the Great Lakes. So just based on that, there's an onus to protect a lot of that nature,
Mm, right.
biodiversity, all that sort of stuff. So I think that the things I would highlight for Ontario farm practices that are really unique is our rotation. So farmers in the province rotate their crops on a 3-year period. So I mentioned the three big crops, corn, soybeans, and wheat. Farmers will have corn planted in one summer, harvested in the autumn. Then the following year, they'll plant soybeans in the spring,
Hmm.
harvested in the autumn. Soybeans are naturally nitrogen fixing, so they don't require as much fertilizer. They actually produce their own nitrogen in the soil. So they almost self-fertilize. And as a legume, they have really great sustainability benefits from that perspective. And in Ontario, we lead in winter wheat production. So after the soybeans are harvested that autumn, farmers will go in and they'll plant winter wheat behind the soybeans. And so that winter wheat will get planted in, say, October, maybe into November, and it will create a living root that covers the ground over the winter. And that reduces soil erosion, it increases soil organic carbon, it supports the microbiology of the soil, and that wheat starts to grow in that living root, and then it sort of goes into a period called vernalization. So it's sort of dormant over the winter. And then right now, springtime, you'll see it starting to reemerge, and you'll drive across the countryside and you'll see these bright green fields that are
Hmm.
look better than your lawn does. And it's because it's had this, living cover, essentially like a cover crop over the field, and then it starts to mature, and then that'll get harvested in July. So having that rotation is really important because it disrupts pest cycles naturally. We use what we call integrated pest management. So you're looking at ways to make sure that you're not growing the same crop over and over again, and you'll have pest populations kind of growing based on that. It sort of disrupts and confuses them. And it also supports from an economic sense, right? Like farmers can kind of buffer themselves against, they're a little bit more diversified in what they're growing in a given year.
Hmm.
So the rotation is really important. I mentioned cover cropping a little bit. We've got the winter wheat, but we also, Ontario leads Canada in the use of cover crops, which are when you plant a crop that's meant to cover the soil when you're not growing winter wheat. So it might be something like red clover, and that again will help with providing more nutrients for the soil, prevent erosion, that sort of stuff. We have a program in Ontario called the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Certification, where farmers have a program of applying their nutrients for the crop the right time, from the right source, in the right amount, in the right place. So really helps to maximize the uptake of nutrients into the crop and avoid nitrous oxide emissions or phosphorus reduction into waterways. So I could go on all day about all the
That's
sustainability
okay.
practices, but there's a lot there. So yeah, there's a lot there. And, always innovating, always looking for new things that fit into a farmer's management plan. Every farm's different. They're not all going to be the same. It really depends on what they're growing, what their soils look like, what the climate looks like at the time of year when they're looking at a practice.
I like that. I'm gonna have to catch up with you offline in order to learn some more because this is really I'm learning a lot right now, but and too much for the podcast at this point. So we are coming to the end of the podcast, and before I let you go, I want to ask you two questions. So I always like to ask my guests about a piece of advice. So what would you say, what general piece of advice would you give to students that are thinking about going into the agricultural field, maybe specifically into grains? They're not quite sure. What advice would you give them?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I would say um, two things. I think I would say don't go in with preconceived notions of what the sector is because it will constantly surprise you. So, even I coming from working for the UK and being close to ag and having a father who is a grain farmer, there's so much about the sector that surprised me when I came into it. The people are more diverse than you think. The practices and the farms and the approaches are different across the province, but they also have so many similarities. And the people have really interesting stories behind their farms and their experiences and how they approach agriculture. So I would say on the outlook, farming might not look as dynamic and exciting as some sectors like tech or
Mm-hmm.
finance or, robotics or those sorts of things, but there's so much to unpack in the sector and it's evolving very quickly. So um, I'd say leave your preconceived notions, explore it, talk to people who are in it, and you might be surprised by what you find. And then I would say think about those big industrial challenges like sustainability or growing food for future populations and align your career to position yourself to help answer some of those questions or provide solutions for them because there's a lot of sectors that are at risk right now or job types that are at risk because AI is changing things. But at the end of the day, everyone needs to eat. So working in agriculture, working for an ingredient product like grains, it has a long, I'd say like it's a pretty secure bet that down the line, the jobs that we're involved in working in that sector might change, but there's still going to be a need to support that sector in one form or another. So keep that in mind in terms of the potential longevity of a career.
I think that's really good advice. And that's where I'm going to leave it with the last question being, where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm there at Dana Dickerson, and I'm on most of the socials. I'm on X and Instagram at Dana Dickerson ON for Ontario.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Dana, for coming on the show. I knew the conversation would be good just from how you spoke to the students at the University of Toronto event. And I've learned a lot about Ontario grains, and I'm really want to learn more. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Thank you so much, Veronica. It was a pleasure.
It's funny how the universe seems to have other plans in store for you, despite how much you seem to run away from them, like we saw in this conversation with Dana. If you're interested to learn more about another career that's in the marketing side of the food industry, then check out my conversation with Kim Shakel, Director of Sales and Marketing at Agri-Food Inc. In this conversation, we dive into why conventional bananas shouldn't be the price that they are, and how Agri-Food is looking to change this without breaking your bank while improving working conditions for farmers.